Policy analysis and public policy making, in theory, should be straightforward. A study and its results are provided by experts. Legislators and staff sort through these different findings, then formulate the propositions through a rational discussion in committees, and finally, then take a vote. However, this view of the legislative branch of government and the process of policy as a hyper-rational, straightforward issue does not take into account the complexity and context of a democracy in which there are competing interests, resource constraints, and the fact that policy analysis is an iterative and repetitive process. To understand policy making, we will first establish the definition and role of policy analysis, and then look at the general state of it through surveys and studies. The traditional view of policy analysis is that of a hyper-rational research bureau, where rigorous empirical research is conducted to maximize social welfare. In contrast to this, there is an interpretive view in which policy analysis is used as a language for framing political discourse, as legitimate rationalization for legislative action, and as a symbol of legitimate decision processes. The study, Can Congress Do Policy Analysis? The Politics of Problem Solving on Capitol Hill, views policy analysis as a combination of these models, as a mix between intelligence and pragmatism, in which, quote, policy analysis stands between pure planning, in which apolitical synoptic rationality guides governance, and raw politics, in which the preferences of the powerful dictate policy prescriptions. As we go through these studies and results, how you view policy analysis will impact your interpretation of results and health of policymaking in general. To understand the current state of policy analysis, we can look at the surveyed members from the organization Associate for Public Policy Analysis and Management. There were a total of 162 responses, with the background of the policy analysts being the following: 42% work in college and universities, 36% work in think tanks, 14% work in the federal executive branch, 8% by government contracts, 8% in state or local government, 4% with nonprofits, and 2% work in advocacy organization or foundations. Most of the members had a liberal skew, but generally were moderate and mostly not anti-Congress. To quickly recap the results, the areas the respondents rated Congress poorly were making evidence-based decisions, taking into account future generations, and distributing benefits equitably. The areas they performed the best on were pleasing interest groups, avoiding negative consequences for business, reflecting public opinion, and bringing attention to new issues. The main reasons experts provided as to why Congress performs poorly were party polarization, re-election pressures, and interest group pressure. For many, these results are old news, but surprisingly, lack of information was not a problem or obstacle for policy. As one member put it, in sum, the main information problem Congress faces is not the absence of evidence, but rather the failure of members to make good use of available information. To further understand how Congress does policy analysis and its flaws, we can look at some of the steps of the process, starting with the first step, defining and recognizing issues. For this step, it seems Congress does not do so well, in which both the paper's respondents and interviews from congressional committee staff said use of policy analysis is mostly to certify and influence priority of proposals on agenda, not to conceptualize problems. Despite this, Congress is relatively receptive to outside pressures and open to addressing new topics, in which 37% of experts surveyed rated Congress's performance good or better in bringing attention to new issues. Moving on to the step of assembling evidence, there are mainly three ways legislators go about gathering information. The first is through staff who consume and summarize policy reports and interact regularly with experts in academia and think tanks. The second is through congressional support agencies such as the Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office. And third is through interest groups. As many already assume, interest groups can and have advocated policy that distorts the economy and results in negative externalities. But at least for this stage of gathering evidence, interest groups can be a good source to compare and contrast information and might be the only source of technical knowledge on a given subject. For the step of constructing alternatives and selecting criteria is where you see the political system at its weakest or strongest, depending on how you view the role of policy analysis. From a traditional perspective of a rational research bureau, Congress does not act very rationally. The paper provides a table of the criteria key findings as to how much each criteria factor has impact on legislative policy. Because I am lazy and not willing to spend money for access to all these studies, we can't go further into how all these findings were deduced. But from the table summary, effectiveness, economic efficiency, and robustness are not major criteria that independently impact legislative behavior and decision-making. The key word being independent. Efficiency is valued in conjunction with another factor, such as constituency opinion or interest groups, but does not seem to stand on its own, as experts in the survey noted. The study Information Sources in State Legislative Decision-Making by Christopher Mooney provides some empirical evidence on the idea that different legislative contexts impact the different usages of evidence and criteria. The basic hypothesis the author gives is that because legislators have intense demands on their time and energy, they are forced to inform themselves as efficiently as possible. Therefore, they are likely to begin with the easiest, most accessible information and search sequentially for that which requires more effort. To test this, 3 information sources and 3 different contexts are defined. The information sources include insiders, which are legislators, colleagues, and staff members. Outsiders are those whose professional experience is least like that of a legislator, such as a constituent, official, the mass media, and academics. And finally, middle-range sources include interest groups and representatives of executive agencies. The 3 different macro distinct legislative contexts or sub-processes are divided between development of legislation, where legislators write and present bills, persuasion, where legislators try to persuade one another to act in certain ways regarding bills before the legislator, and finally, roll call voting, where legislators vote on a bill. The data used were bill files and written information from state capitol offices from a sample of members of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, Oregon, and Indiana, following their regular 1989 sessions. These bill files are the most complete record available of all the written information used by a legislator on a bill. A sample of 12 human service bills were identified by 2 committee staff members in each house as representative of the committee's workload in terms of the bill's importance, controversiality, and interest group activity. Legislators were asked to then sort the documents into 5 categories, 3 for one of the sub-processes type, 1 for a mix of all, and 1 for not used at all. As evident in the table findings, the author notes legislators deciding on their votes used more insider information. Those persuading their colleagues used more middle-range information, and those writing bills used more outside information than do those participating in the other sub-processes. These findings tend to reflect the mixed view of policy analysis, in which it is neither completely subject to social and political interests, nor is it dictated by just raw logic and rationality. There is a second study which supports this interpretive view of policy analysis, in which policy usage is to compete and frame issues. With this perspective in mind, the author suggests committees are going to have a greater need for policy analysis when they face greater jurisdictional competition, because of the value of information in framing and interpreting issues advantageously. This leads to the hypothesis that policy analysis used by committees is greater in cases of jurisdictional competition than in cases of jurisdictional monopoly. The author argues if policy analysis is used as a problem-solving tool from the traditional perspective, there might actually be less usage of analysis with jurisdictional competition, because no single committee would be in a position to approach the issue comprehensively. The dependent variable, the usage of policy analysis, is measured by the number of citations of analytical reports in the committee reports filed of the House of Representatives from 1985 to 1994. The independent variable of jurisdictional competition is measured by the type of committee, with the lowest competition being split and the highest being sequential primary. As the results indicate, there is a strong support for the first hypothesis that use of policy analysis will be greater where jurisdiction is competitive. Some interesting notes were that policy analysis is frequently cited in the latter section of the committee process, and the committee with the highest average usage, in this case science, space, and technology, cited no analytic reports for one of its 3 cases. Additionally, the Judiciary Committee cited no analytic reports in 6 of its 17 cases, but cited reports 72 times in a single case. Looking at the projecting outcome step, there is some positive news. In this step, the paper noted CBO's budget scores are highly consequential, and experts note that the most important influences on assessing a quality of a bill is the CBO estimate of its cost. These reports are noted to have had a significant impact on the development of reform proposals and often causes committees to reconsider proposals. Overall, Congress, and by extension, governments, have mixed results in terms of policy analysis. On the one hand, these institutions are influenced and undermined to a degree by interest groups and polarization. They tend to perform poorly in taking into account long-term effects of policy and of distributing benefits equally. However, at the same time, Congress is relatively good at bringing attention to new issues, reflecting public opinion, and completing policy objectives at a reasonable cost. What are the ways then to improve this process? The paper concludes that what is arguably needed to improve Congress's performance as a problem-solving institution are not additional analytic boosters, but rather changes in legislative norms and practices. This need for changing practices is highlighted by the fact that the institutional knowledge base of committees has been weakened by staff turnover. At one time, you had staff directors who were there for 10, 15, and 20 years, and not only developed a lot of expertise, but who would have also worked for both Republicans and Democrats. Today, you have a high rate of turnover. Much of the work resides in committees, which can make the difference in the implementation and quality of legislation. One way to improve the process would involve getting staff and analysts involved earlier in development of legislation. A former senior policy analyst stated, "The earlier that policy analysts get involved, the larger the impact and the better the policy." Highly motivated staff may have considerable discretion in what issues they choose to develop and their implementation. In this environment, policy analysis would serve as a means to elevate the level of debate and deliberation. Some might see Congress and other governments' poor performance in absorbing expert knowledge to actually be a good thing, since much of policy analysis and studies are performed by an elite group of people. Congress is a representative body, and its resistance to elite thinking could serve as a good balance to the executive and judiciary, which are both mostly unelected. This issue is best summarized by a statement from David Mayhew. In any society, common sense versus expertise is an opposition that will not go away. In the American system, it is up for grabs of how much we are willing to trust scientific, bureaucratic, legal, or moral experts. Congress helps supply an assurance that their ideas need to be sold, not just proclaimed.